So welcome then everyone based on that to today's webinar. So I'm going to be presenting on the topic of harnessing big data and tracking COVID-19. Are we discussing this in terms of a technological panacea or a digital Pandora's box? So the webinar outline for today follows as is. First of all, it is to present and identify the ways increasingly in which big data approaches have been applied to track, to understand, and to identify COVID-19 infections across the globe as the pandemic has continued over the past few months. So within the context of the presentation and the discussions today, the areas that I would very much like to demonstrate and to speak to you and then further discuss with you are what are some of the ways in which big data, when we talk about big data, is being used to track and identify the pandemic in different countries. How are these practices being applied? So when we talk about big data, how are they being leveraged? How are they being applied? Where are the technologies being applied? And are we talking about global level? Are we talking about national level initiatives to track infection cases as well? And ultimately, what are the implications of the use of these new technologies, which rely on big data and big tech mediation during the COVID global pandemic? So the webinar speaks to and engages with a broader research question that I've been working with through a lot of my time in my role as LSE Global Health Fellow, which is what happens when we digitize and datafy global health security practices. And as I spoke to earlier, ultimately, I think the aim of the webinar today is to understand further how do we, as LSE Health Policy MSc candidates, as health policy researchers, policymakers, leaders, future leaders, I say this to our candidates in our MSc candidates in the department, how do we engage and understand and unpack what I understand and present as a very pressing and expanding health policy challenge, which is the growing impacts of big data and big tech and infectious disease security responses. Now, first of all, sort of broadly introducing this notion or these discussions, situating these discussions of big tech and big data within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So over the past 2 decades, we have read about, spoken about, have witnessed and discussed the discussions of big data and how big data can be used to produce new insights and forecasts across a broad spectrum of fields. So we've seen these discussions and what big data can do in the areas of policing and counterterrorism. We've seen a lot of research in the areas of marketization in the financial sector, also in the judiciary system. But increasingly, big data and the application of big data and the harnessing of big data has increasingly migrated into global health security practices, located very much within infectious disease surveillance. Now, a critical point to highlight is that despite the frenzy and the interest and the willingness to rush to harness big data and to apply it to a whole bunch of different areas of study, the term big data is extremely varied. It's extremely complex. It's oftentimes contending and contrasting. However, we tend, as big data scholars, to find 3 common features when we discuss or when we seek to understand big data. So we can understand, first of all, big data as constituting data sources. Now, sources of big data can include data that is collected from phone towers, mobile phone towers, and mobile phone apps. We can also understand it as data sources as produced from Bluetooth connections, surveillance videos, images collected from drones and data collected from drone technology as well, social media feeds, smart technology, such as focuses on smart houses, smart thermometers, credit card records, wearables, etc. But it refers to an extremely broad spectrum of new data sources produced by the Internet of Things, and also by what we often talk about as the digital turn in society. The second way in which you might understand big data is big data as understood through technologies and infrastructures which are capable of processing big data, which is essentially data and data sets that require computation to have meaning and understanding to the data. Again, when we talk about technologies and infrastructures capable of processing this scale and scope of data, we often talk about digital algorithms, data warehouses, cloud computing, machine learning techniques, and artificial intelligence associated technologies. These form what we often call big data ecologies or big data infrastructures. The third critical way in which we can also understand big data within our contemporary times is big data as a belief or as an ideology. And here we refer to supporters of big data or uncritical supporters of big data as the big data prophets, right? Individuals, groups, corporations, businesses that push the idea that big data analytics and big data analysis somehow represents a specific break from previous systems of knowledge generation. Big data in many areas has been in the past presented as a new scientific paradigm in which to understand and anticipate events. And a very famous book, for those of you interested, by Cukier and Meyer-Schoenberger, once presented big data as a revolution that will transform the way we live, the way we work, and the way we think. Now, locating the interest in harnessing big data with past transformations in infectious disease surveillance and global health security, what we have seen, and those of us that are within the department working in the areas of health security, pandemic preparedness, we will already know that over the past decade alone, we have witnessed the declaration of 6 public health emergencies of international concern. Starting in 2009 with the H1N1 swine flu pandemic, followed by the 2014 resurgence of polio, followed by the 2014 West African Ebola epidemic, the 2015-2016 Zika virus epidemic, and now the situation in which we find ourselves in, the global COVID-19 pandemic. However, what we have witnessed with each unfolding public health emergency over the past decade is that within contexts of big data and new data sources and increased digitization, states and intergovernmental organizations have demonstrated broadening and intensifying interests in amassing more and more data sources in order to predict disease outbreaks before they happen or in their early state of emergence, in order to get ahead of the epidemic curve, as it's so called. This, for example, has been highlighted recently in a World Health Organization report, which underlined that the era of big data holds enormous potential for the future of public health surveillance, following significant advancements in the capacity to collect and share data from previously unimagined sources, such as social media data and geospatial mobile phone data. Again, talking back to the abundance of new data sources that we now find ourselves in as a result of technological innovation and advancement over the past 2 decades. What is key to remember, though, is the origins of digital health surveillance and accessing new data sources, in fact, goes back much farther. We can talk, for example, over the past 25 years of the origins of digital disease surveillance. So a key takeaway in this discussion is that while we are witnessing, within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, new data-driven and intensifying data-driven practices in infectious disease surveillance in order to harness big data sources, these logics of accessing digital data, new data sources, of using mediums including the computer, the internet, mobile phones, social media, they are not novel within this particular pandemic, nor have they only sprung forward in the context of this pandemic. So we can trace a lineage that goes back as early as 1995 with one of the first open source online disease surveillance systems, which was called ProMed Mail, which at the time essentially traded information over an email server to physicians around the world, which identified in advance an alert of an outbreak of Ebola, which was happening in Zaire, now the DRC. Again, in 2002, the Global Public Health Intelligence Network, which again was an early prototype and online syndromic surveillance system, provided advanced detection of atypical pneumonia, which was circulating in Guangdong, China, which later formed the origins of the SARS epidemic. And of course, the infamous 2009 Google Flu Trends experiment, in which Google and its in-house surveillance device, Google Flu Trends, claimed to predict patterns of seasonal influenza more rapidly than the CDC and traditional health authorities using tabulated web query data. So again, it is important to remember within these discussions that this need to seek new data sources and to employ big data has roots and origins that date far, far back beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. However, what we are witnessing within this particular pandemic is an intensification of efforts and initiatives by states, by international health organizations, and by tech corporations to digitize and datafy infectious disease surveillance practices. Within this pandemic, the hallmark of the pandemic that we can see is the merging, on one hand, of big tech, and on the other, of big data, in order to assist states and to assist governments in tracking and identifying infection rates and affected populations across states. And this is happening across the world, across states, and across states with diversities of governance structures and healthcare systems. Exemplifying this digital turn towards piloting new forms of surveillance and new surveillance technologies for tracking pandemic and infection is a quote. The world has faced pandemics before, but this time we have a new superpower. That is the ability to collect, to gather, and to share data for good. This quote has been put forward, of course, by no other than sort of the symbol of big tech, Facebook's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg. Now, as we have traced so far within the context, the unfolding context of the COVID-19 pandemic, around the world, irrespective of state or context, what we can see is big data sources and technologies are currently being used to support three primary functions of pandemic management for COVID-19. The first, and anybody who's been tuning into media here in the UK recently, very much focused on the topic, is in the use of contact tracing apps. So contact tracing apps have been rolled out in a variety of countries, in a high list of countries, in Singapore, in Switzerland, in Australia, in Qatar, in the UK. Perhaps, as we said, this system has been extensively stalled and has been stalled yet again in the UK context, so we will see, and plus many, many other countries. It is also being used for symptom checking and analysis apps. So essentially, people who fear that they might be showing symptoms or might have come into contact with those with COVID-19 upload this data into usually checking apps and receive some sort of verification as to whether or not they need to seek healthcare services. So an example of symptom checking and analysis includes Spain's system, Corona Madrid, for checking systems as well. There are also proposals on part of the World Health Organization that is developing a symptom checking analysis app in order to be used in resource-constrained settings. And also use in quarantine control and monitoring. This means using big data and tracking technologies to make sure that populations in areas where quarantine has been imposed stay in place, stay in their house, and abide by public health measures. This has been piloted and used, for example, in South Korea. And also it's been made quite famous by Taiwan's electric fence program. So again, we talk about big data, we talk about the involvement of big tech, we talk about how it is being manifested and piloted in many different countries, and we can talk about the use for contact tracing apps, symptom checking and analysis, and quarantine control and monitoring. However, those within critical data studies, concerned citizens, advocacy groups worry that this willingness to rush to the use of big data and to simply allow big tech to assist governments and to assist states pushes us forward to the dangers of what we call big data disasters. Big data disasters occur in contexts where innovation trumps regulation, or innovation trumps oversight. Citizens are not informed of how the data might be used, abused, or reused during or after the pandemic. States might take advantage of these periods of security and exception to use, in effect, dual-use technologies for tracking populations as well. And there are many fears and reasons, I think, to be cautious about the rapid rolling out of big data and the role of big tech, particularly within this public health emergency that we're discussing today. Now, as we said, all of this is happening in very fast real-time situations. It is also happening within a highly securitized global pandemic. We have noticed, again, within critical health security and critical data studies, two problematic areas, two very worrying areas of what happens when we resort to using big data sources on one hand, and when we allow a free hand with big tech in assisting states and governments. Now, the first transformation, which is troubling, is essentially the role of dual-use technologies for disease surveillance, which have severe implications for human rights and privacy, and also surveillance creep. That is, technologies which were designed for one purpose can linger on and serve other purposes after the pandemic subsides. Now, we have seen this in a number of countries already. For example, in Iran, in March, there was the COVID symptom checker app scandal, in which individuals who were putting information into a symptom checking app, it was later revealed that the app in Iran was also used to locate the whereabouts and the addresses of people who were inputting the information into the symptom checking app. In Russia, we have seen the installation of thousands of street cameras in cities across Russia, enabled with facial recognition technology, with very little clarity or guidance on how long these street cameras enabled with facial recognition technology will be in place. In Israel, there was a lot of discussion about the use of a contact tracing app, which originally had been migrated over and utilized software for tracking the movement and GPS of individuals, which was based on counter-terrorist software. And in China, in March, there was also the announcement of Hanvan Technology Limited. This is a very large AI firm which does a lot of contracting for the Chinese government, of Hanvan Technology Limited's ability to use facial recognition software to identify individuals and their identity, even when they were wearing face masks. Right? So we can talk about the dangers to human rights, privacy, and surveillance, which happens from essentially the unregulated use of dual-use technologies, particularly in states with strong authoritarian governance cultures. Closer to home, however, when we talk about EU and UK contexts, there is increased concern about the stake in which big tech corporations are having in assisting healthcare systems and national governments with responses to this particular public health emergency. Now, in the UK context, we can talk about the controversy that was created when NHSX announced that it was creating a data store system to better analyze and understand data and to make resource allocations for dealing with this pandemic. Some of the partners who were conscripted, big tech partners in this, were Google, So for those of you that are familiar with the Royal Free London Trust and Google DeepMind scandal, the involvement of Google again in an NHS project caused a lot of public unease and anxiety, but also the role of Palantir. And for those of you who are familiar with Palantir Technologies, this is an extremely controversial AI group based in the United States that in the past has served everything from providing information to immigration authorities in the States, which has been used for the separation and deportation of migrant families, to particular security decisions that have been made within Iraq. So again, very sort of opaque big data characters with previous troubling applications of past work. There has also been a lot of discussion and concern over the contact tracing app that has been currently being designed by the NHS and promoted as world beating by Boris Johnson. And again, this is very much focused on the UK government continuing to want to pursue a centralized design of the app in which the collected data is stored on a remote server, as opposed to the decentralized design, which is actually being widely used by many European countries, which in fact the data is then stored on the phone of the user and provides for more privacy settings and protection. So again, a lot of kind of concern about the focus and the drive to have this on a centralized system in the UK as opposed to a decentralized system. And of course, in recent days, there has been the EU member states' pushback against Apple and Google's role in designing contact tracing apps and imposing this technology on countries as well as the only way to do digital contact tracing. And the call by the 5 EU member states that the EU needs to curate and practice as it would new forms of digital sovereignty when dealing with big tech corporations in everyday settings, but particularly during acute emergencies such as a pandemic. So this puts us in a very difficult position. As the discussion has shown so far today, there are supplemental values that can be brought forward when harnessing big data. It remains very difficult given sort of the rapidly changing situation in the COVID pandemic for security theorists, for practitioners, for citizens, for concerned advocates as well, to assess the impacts of the digital term of infectious disease surveillance. On one hand, some of the pros we can speak about is the easy access to innovation and advancements that are offered to us by tech providers and by the tech infrastructures that do exist. We can also talk about increased coverage, increased communication, and increased connectivity that can transfer data, that can transfer findings, that can transfer information and bring communities together during critical points of the outbreak as well. And of course, for healthcare systems, we've discussed this very much throughout our seminars and modules during our time in the department, but the need for cost-effective support and rapid interventions, which many of these big data approaches and big tech corporations are very much pushing as a pro for constrained healthcare systems. However, on the other hand, there are many, many troubling cons that we can speak of and that we have already observed within the context of this current pandemic. For example, the inability to extricate corporate interests from public good remains an enormous challenge when dealing with corporations such as Google, or the motives of such as Palantir. There are also concerns, particularly again in states with strong authoritarian government cultures, but also within the context of the UK, which already has its own enormous permanent surveillance infrastructure, about the extension of the surveillance state and the inability of populations to resist these new forms of power. And of course, when talking about big tech and big data, the ongoing issues with opacity, the accountability of these organizations, and the traceability of intentions, objectives, outcomes, and impacts due to complexity, to the complex technological networks and ecologies in which big data is created. Simply put, many of us do not simply know the whole story, and finding the whole story out is an extremely difficult and opaque process. Now, so far, I've worked to highlight the ways in which big data and big tech are affecting responses with this current pandemic, with the current COVID-19 pandemic. We've teased out sort of where these transformations are happening, the forms in which they are taking, and we've also worked to present the implications of what happens when we digitize and datafy global health security responses to pandemic risks. Now, obviously, I'm very interested in getting your thoughts. I'm very interested in knowing what you think and how you engage with this topic as well. So to support our discussions as well, I've produced kind of 3 questions to kind of get us thinking and get us discussing along the lines of what has just been presented. But I would like to know what you think. I mean, first of all, can we successfully respond to emergent epidemics and pandemics without resorting to big tech and big data? How can citizens and states work to regulate the place and impacts of big tech during public health emergencies? And after COVID-19, can we prevent future epidemics and pandemics by harnessing more big data? So is harnessing more big data the key to stopping future pandemics? So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention so far in the presentations, and I very much welcome your thoughts and what you have to say now. Thank you very much, everyone.
Can we ask questions?
Yes, of course.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you very much, and it was very interesting. I just would like to make a comment on something, like maybe what do you think about it? So in terms of all these apps coming out, and basically for the track and tracing and all this, what you've been explaining very well, one of the things that maybe on our side as economists, we try then to evaluate that and to see if that apps are really efficient or not, and what is the implication of that in solving this pandemic mainly. The problem that we usually face in terms of data is that these apps are voluntary, so you can register or not. So, and the problem is that when we want to evaluate things like that and we want to see if they are really efficient, if we don't have a big number or a big group of population there, then it's not really easy to assess what's happening with the apps. And I was just listening at some news recently that were saying that all these apps, if they need at least 60% of the population involved into it, because if not, they might not be efficient. So, but that's tricky in the same way as you were saying that maybe people are reluctant to get into that for privacy purposes. So yeah. It's a bit of a trade-off, but I find the topic interesting. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you.
No, thank you, Laia, and that's an excellent point. And this is, again, this comes back to sort of how much the situation of app uptake impacting the outcomes of the pandemic, and I think, as you said, showing that they're worth the investment. This is where it changes a lot depending on politics and governance structures. So the most successful apps have been in places like South Korea and in Taiwan, where there tends to be kind of, very high expectations on transparency on the government, and also on the fact as well that, the government will deliver on the things it tells the people that it is doing. So a transparent culture is essential in these situations as well. I think if you situate it back to what's currently going on here in the UK with like the lagging faith in government, and the fact as well that the government has said up until now that, rightfully so, these apps are still going to be non-mandatory, right? They're voluntary. But it does really affect, I think the long-term viability of if they're going to work or not, because if there is such diminished faith in the government, and there is such a reticence to use these apps because of concerns about centralization, that the data is being held in another place, and it, it can come under data breaches or leaks or hacks as well, then people aren't going to sign up for it, and they aren't going to then achieve their outcomes in the end. So yeah, really important discussion point as well in all of this is context. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephen, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Hi.
Sarah.
Yes, this is Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
So I'm reading your question after COVID-19. Can we prevent future epidemics and pandemics by using big data? Wouldn't that require a level of international coordination that seems to be decreasing instead of increasing?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's an excellent point as well, Sarah. So the thing that I find interesting in research right now is that, and as you said in your point, this kind of comes back to, rather than a global health response, the response to this pandemic has been led by states, right? Operating their own policies. Some are effective, some are not effective, some are, in line with international health policy legislations, some are not. They kind of throw completely out the window. So I think if we are taking it from like a global health security or global health good perspective, then yes, it's completely lacking integration, and it's all still happening at the level of the sovereign state. And I think after that, there are really kind of critical questions about again situating it back into things that we observed with failures in this country deal with the pandemic. There are comments and kind of studies and reports going back right now as far as 2014 saying that this country was not ready for a flu pandemic, right? And this wasn't about how much big data you have. This came back to, again, things that we've seen where it's, how much protective gear are there for frontline workers? How much budget is allocated to preparedness activities? How robust is the healthcare system? What about health equity? So I've said this before, kind of in some of the talks I've been giving, but you cannot simply big data your way out of a pandemic, right? Mm-hmm.
I have another one.
Yes, you're more than welcome. If anyone else would like to speak after Sarah, please feel free to do so too. But yes, Sarah, let's hear it.
What do you think? Do you think this will catalyze change in the role of the WHO for the future?
I mean, the interesting thing so far has been that I think WHO has been so submerged in so many other kind of areas of urgency and controversy that there hasn't been a lot said on, what they can do with big data. I think the WHO line is probably always kind of, use it in a way that, is respectful of privacy, use it in a way that kind of promotes health equity amongst, populations and countries. But I think I would stop short of saying that, in the future or directly after this, the WHO is going to kind of take a frontline stance and kind of talking about, what to do with big data and how to sort of take on big tech in a way that, produces equitable outcomes. I don't think they have the capacity or necessarily the energy to do that just yet. Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Yes, Margaret here.
Hi, Margaret.
Hi. As an older person, I've obviously seen the world changing over quite a long period.
Yes.
And I'm asking a question, really, can we do without big data in the future? Mm-hmm. When I think the way communications have changed in my lifetime, physical communications, the way people mingle or travel, connect across the world so easily as compared when I was a child, I feel big data has to be there. I'm not saying it shouldn't be controlled. I mean, we have the issue of social media now, and should it be more controlled, etc. But I feel big data has a place. I don't see any alternative really, because we're going to have to react so much more quickly than in the past. I remember when I was very, very small, I can remember my sister being taken off to an isolation hospital with scarlet fever, as we called it. People were isolated for TB, but it was a much slower process. You had our contacts were so much more limited than they are now. So I'm just, I'm not an expert in any way in this area, but just listening to what's happened with COVID-19, I have signed in to 2 apps collecting information. I'm very happy to do that. I just think it has to be there, but somehow, and we have to face up to these issues of some societies misusing it, you know, for political means. So it's a very, very complex issue in my view, and it's very interesting to hear you today.
Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, and I mean, you bring an excellent point forward, and I think one of the things that that is important to highlight, I mean, in my own role, kind of as a critical sort of big data theorist, is that I often find myself kind of you know, a bit irritated when big data is presented as either good or bad, right? As you rightly said, you know, big data and, you know, the ability to have this data and to analyze it for all types of purposes. You know, there have been really promising things done, and there will be even more as it advances. As you were kind of speaking to as well, you know, with any type of technological advance, there's always the need to regulate, right? And to have these discussions, to have these examinations as well. And I think when we talk about regulation, the most important thing is that we don't think of regulation in the context of big data as something that is elitist. So this is something that, you know, the entire kind of spectrum of society needs to be involved and educated and literate on, and that it's an ongoing process, right? It's not an endpoint with big data. It's a continual conversation and a continual vigilance, right? But absolutely, there are many, many pluses to be had from it as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really fascinating. I had a question. I wanted to get your perspective on not so much big data, but sort of big information and the speed of information that's passing, particularly during this pandemic. And that quote you shared by Mark Zuckerberg was quite interesting. And we've seen sort of WHO and a lot of other health agencies sort of struggle with sort of this infodemic and trying to stem the speed of infodemic. And a lot of these platforms, a lot of norms have been changing slowly. And a lot of these platforms who once said, no, we can't be the arbiter of what gets put online, now all of a sudden starting to sort of put warning signs on what gets put online. I think you probably have seen the Trump one today. So I just want to get your perspective on that.
Well, thank you, Charles, and hello, by the way.
Hello.
So I think in terms of infodemics, and I think in terms of to what extent, you know, a lot of the tech corporations that now control or don't control the flow of information, right? I think the one thing that I've been struck with within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic is that there's not really kind of, there's not much of a framework or a convention of why they do what they do and why they act the way they do when they want, right? So we often kind of see Facebook saying, you know, we don't kind of regulate this or kind of struggles with this. And then there's, you know, the moments where they step in and say, no, we are going to regulate this, right? There is, and I think it's actually included in the references in the slides, which will be available, but there was a really interesting article in The Atlantic that I was reading recently that was basically talking about how this kind of chop and change behavior of Facebook and of Twitter ultimately sort of undermines the whole concept of the internet that was supposed to be meant for free speech that wasn't politicized, right? Or wasn't kind of decided what you can and can't say. But so I think kind of speaking back to your original question on that, I think the inconsistencies like demonstrated by these big tech firms and kind of a lack of real kind of sticking to whatever convention they, you know, say they will be. It makes the concept, I think, of the infodemic more severe, and I think it also makes it kind of seemingly more without end, because there is not really kind of an end to it if, you know, there are no clear stances taken by big tech on it, right? Only kind of very ad hoc moments of we will regulate or we won't regulate.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, but the Atlantic article, it's something about how COVID has changed the internet, or why free speech will never be the same after COVID, or something like this. But I'll try to find the point for you, Charles.
Thanks.
Hi, Stephen. Derek here.
Hi, Derek.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Good, thanks. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I guess following on from Charles's point, do you see that one way forward, or is it a possibility, from your knowledge, to look at regulation in the context of ownership of data? So we have GDPR in Europe, and whether or not that could be a means by which legislation could be brought in to protect or kind of manage the way that data is used.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's many different ways of exploring. So I think what it comes back to is ultimately educating individuals and educating communities and societies about what happens when big data is harnessed in a way that is unregulated, or when we continue to allow big tech to sort of just act in sort of a Wild West way, right? So I think when you talk about mechanisms like the GDPR, I think it's done a lot for showing people, what their data is, what the significance of it is, how it can be misused. So I think this is a really kind of important aspect of education that we can talk about when we talk about like the broader activities of regulation. I think the other thing to kind of, formal perhaps versus informal, is that, these companies, despite they are so big and omnipresent and opaque, they still do not like bad publicity, right? So Google and Google DeepMind are still really, really smarting after the revelations of what happened with the Royal London Free Trust, right? And so I think on one hand, you can have, as we said, sort of, formal systems of educating people on data and their data ownership and the dangers of what happens when their data is reappropriated, but also continuing, the activities, I think, of the whistleblower, and continuing to bring the public's reaction to, gross events like this when they happen, is also a really important catalyst in pushing the need to discuss and be vigilant and regulate further along